Welcome to Proles.
Hello, and welcome to Proles Pod, your bi-weekly dose of
Culture, politics, and history.
without the liberalism. As you probably noticed, that intro is slightly different. That's because we are going to be moving away from the name Proles of the Round Table and toward what everyone already calls us, Proles Pod. And we are going to also kind of broaden our topic base from history to kind of history and culture, but the main focus will still be history. Moving on. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at ProlesPod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving a 5-star review on any of the various podcast catchers is the best way to do that. And then if you would like to keep your ear to the ground, we will have the Patreon launching soon. So look at our social medias and the patreon.com/ProlesPod for information on when you'll be able to, donate to our cause. And there's going to be a lot of cool stuff there. So yeah. This episode is brought to you by former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who gave us the gift of disorganized crime this holiday season.
It's really sweet of him. He's a generous guy.
Yes. Today, we're going to be talking about the current Mexican government and who's likely to win the June 2nd, 2024 election. But first, I would like to introduce our subject matter experts and the newest proles, Rae and Martín. Take it away.
Woo! Ladies first, babe.
Okay. Hi, my name is Martín. I have a career in content. The rest of the trolls have to deal with me writing it always in quotes because I hate it. And I guess you'll get to know me a bit better as the podcast moves through. But I think the most important thing that I bring to the podcast now, or rather what I am valued for besides my editing skills, is that I am not from America.
Hey.
Death to America.
Death to America.
Death to America.
Now you go, babe.
Okay. And just in case anyone listening thinks that we have an intimacy that exceeds that of co-podcasters or comrades, it is because we are, in fact, married. Hi, I'm Rae. I am American. I live in not America with my not American husband. Longtime listener, first time at what just stopped being the round table. And I'm so excited to be here.
Bless.
Hell yeah. And then the veteran, Tony.
Hey guys, so one thing I do want to correct here, some slander against my name. So Martín, as a reminder, I'm not American, I'm Canadian.
Oh,
Big
no.
difference.
Martín,
Big
canceled.
Sorry.
Canceled on Twitter.
Sorry.
Okay.
I've overspent.
But actually, as we get into this episode, we'll see that there's really an entire debate about what it means to be so-called American.
Ooh.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right. And then I'm Justin and
I'm Jeremy. Just
Sweet.
here.
yeah. So I guess where do you guys want to start this thing?
Okay, so I think it's worth noting, right, that we're not experts in the academic sense, but we both have a lot of experience with and some understanding of Mexican culture, history, and politics. We've each spent years in the country and both have considerable ties to Mexico. The reason that I felt sort of inspired to do this episode is because I have seen and heard and read repeatedly things written by leftists in English, people whose work that I really, really admire and really, really respect, kind of lionizing the current administration in Mexico in a way that honestly compares the current president AMLO to kind of like an Allende figure. And I think the reason for this partially is because we're kind of just like talking about Latin America and because AMLO was democratically elected. And honestly, both of them have kind of like uncomfortably close relationships to the military. And what I have to say about this is if you think that socialist means implementing reforms that genuinely help working and marginalized people without challenging capitalism, then yes, 100% AMLO is a socialist.
All right. Thanks for coming on. That's the end of the episode.
But if you think socialist means communist or someone with the intention to move toward communism, then no, he's not a socialist. And also, nor did he, nor his party Morena ever claim to want to do that. And it's really, in general, kind of shocking how much of a sort of like black box Mexican news and politics are for English speakers. In fact, right, like this is the first Proles episode on Mexico. So we want to take some time first to just set the tone by explaining what will be like a very brief and in no way comprehensive history of Mexico and their political and electoral systems, just because they're quite different than what especially a US audience would be accustomed to. We're going to look at the current administration, whether or not he is truly worthy of all of the praise, as well as his successor, a woman named Claudia Sheinbaum, and what that could mean if she is elected in the June 2nd upcoming election for the future of Mexico. So obviously we're drawing from a really wide variety of sources in English, in Spanish, historical, academic, journalistic, from all facets of the political spectrum. That said, we're trying to cover hundreds of years of history, so we won't be able to speak to everything. If there's any of your favorite escandalos that we miss, please let us know by emailing us
at prolespod@outlook.com.
and we'll take it into consideration and maybe do another episode. Also, something that we're not fully ready to share about yet, but please keep paying attention, because if you have quick questions or questions that we just find are really, really juicy and really worth our time, we might create special secret content for Patreon subscribers.
Ooh.
So maybe that will incentivize you to want to join.
Hell yeah. Perfect.
So if you've heard these like really, really glowing positive accounts, this is to counter that with just a little bit more of a nuanced perspective. And if you're listening to this and you're actually like, oh shit, I literally don't know anything about Mexican politics, we hope that this can serve as a useful primer. Starting with a little linguistic note. Since Mexico and the US obviously share a land border, I want to acknowledge a trend that I've seen mostly with liberals. Some of my best friends are liberal. That is literally not true. But increasingly in leftist spaces as well. And that's criticizing the use of the word America in reference to the United States of America, because both continents, or the supercontinent, the so-called in theory, right, both continents, or the supercontinent from so-called Canada all the way down to Chile and Argentina, make up the Americas. And a proposed solution to this is often to call America the States. But the full name of Mexico, when translated into English, is actually the United Mexican States, or the United States of Mexico. So while words mean things, and obviously I'm always the one talking about language, I've brought the woke mind virus to the Proles, I think it's fair to note that the limitation is accurate, but the solution is not that straightforward. So going ahead, we're likely to use words like the US, the States, and America interchangeably to refer to the United States of America, and Mexico to refer to the United Mexican States.
Mm-hmm. Fair.
All in all, AMLO had some wins that really earned the support of working Mexican people, and that is to be lauded. And he also had some pretty big disappointments that we're going to get into. Well, I think there's a clear and obvious argument that he's not attempting to steer Mexico towards socialism or communism. He still to this day has an approval rating of almost, I think, 70%. And before COVID, it was above 80%.
That's kind of like Lula.
And that's like 3 Joe Bidens.
Is AMLO actually 3 Joe Bidens in a trench coat?
I mean, he certainly has that like elder drawl.
Okay. Is he sleepy AMLO? Is he?
Oh yeah. Even though he makes all of Mexico wake up at 6 for his daily press conferences.
That is true. And Mexico is a country that Martin's about to tell you about with a long history of electoral fraud. So the fact that so much of the population really likes him is really worth noting. And it's also worth noting that many statistics suggest that his approval among working people has increased during his presidency, and that the drop in percentage of approval is actually from so-called middle class or more affluent people. So you can love AMLO or hate him. I still think that this episode raises valid questions for us as communists about things like the effectiveness of electoral politics in Mexico and obviously elsewhere, the importance of anti-imperial movements and autonomy for all nations, even if they're not moving in a communist direction, the benefits and limitations of reforms, and even sometimes the de-radicalizing effect that reforms can have. I'm not suggesting that I'm an accelerationist. I don't think that the ends justify the means. I don't want to make life worse for proletarians, but just acknowledging that sometimes even the most modest reforms can really have a pacifying effect on a population, as well as examining, the importance of ongoing work of raising political and class consciousness. So, without overly praising or vilifying him, we aim to examine the rise of his party, Morena, in the broader context of Mexican politics, and to leave it to you guys to decide what you think.
And with that, I'll start with a bit of Mexican history. I'm condensing 300 years and clearly skipping pre-colonial history and the Conquista because we don't have, this is not going to be like a four-parter. But to paraphrase Sagan, to make an apple pie, you must first learn a brief history of Mexico.
Nice.
So first off, a primer on Mexican institutions. The office of the President of the Mexican United States, as Rae said before, that is Mexico's government name. There is no VP in this whole shebang. In case of calamity, the Secretary of the Interior is sworn in. For our American listeners, no, it's not the Park Secretary, but something more like a Home Affairs Security Office. It's a 6-year term. We'll do a deeper dive into this. Just know that this is the result of General Porfirio Diaz, who's like the greatest rebrander in Mexican history because everybody forgets to address him as the military guy he was. He re-elected himself for 30 years straight until the revolution, the Mexican Revolution. And at the beginning of the 20th century, Mexican developed a potent allergy against re-election. In keeping with the 6-year format, midterms are every 3 years. The INE, or the only electoral institution in Latin America that actually works, is the Instituto Nacional Electoral, the National Electoral Institute. It is the latest evolution of many federal organs in charge of regulating elections and registering voters. It went from being a dependency of the Secretary of Home Affairs, meaning it was directly under the jurisdiction of the executive branch, to a truly independent regulator of any federal electoral process. Ironically enough, its current form is the result of package reforms from a conservative coalition in Congress. Little trivia, the national ID in Mexico is the INE card, meaning that you are registered to vote automatically when coming of age. They also regulate and audit campaign finances to ensure equality among participating parties in a race, are very stringent on what can and can't be said in political messaging. Here's an example. Current conservative candidate Xochitl Gomez tweeted a hypothetical campaign billboard that included the INE branding, and they went apeshit for it and asked for an immediate retraction from her. And finally, they have the authority to redistrict, which would be very good in any other place.
What was on the billboard? I'm sorry, I missed that part.
They have to approve messaging as it can't involve them because they're actually, like a impartial auditor of the whole affair. So any messaging can't involve them. And also, if messaging can be misconstrued or can be deceiving, they're also after that too. But that gotcha. One's a bit more of a slippery slope because what can be deceiving?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And again, they do all this while being fully independent branch of government, or as independent as you can be in a place like Mexico. Voting in Mexico, it is plurality vote, it is federal, it is bicameral, and it's non-compulsory. All that, of course, was in name only during 70 years, while the PRI, the Partido de Revolución Institucional, was in power in what Peruvian writer Mario Vargas Llosa described as the perfect dictatorship. And he did this on national Mexican television, so balls on that guy.
Amazing.
This prolongation of the party in the presidency, of course, coming from electoral fraud, each president handpicking its successor with the famous dedazo or the big finger until their first primary in 99. In 96,
finger pointing.
Party decay.
It translates better to finger pointing. The big finger, it's kind of something else.
Everyone likes the big finger. I don't
Big
know
finger
why.
sounds better.
Big finger.
Motion to move Mexico toward the big finger.
All in favor?
Well-
Say, ah!
Give us the big finger.
Give us a finger that you think we deserve.
So in 96, due to party decay, dismal approval, and the need to project a modern liberal Mexico abroad, they finally gave in and made the IFE, the precursor to the INE, autonomous and moved it out of the executive branch. This, of course, opened the way for them to lose the majority in both chambers for the first time, and then their first presidential defeat in 2000. Parties in Mexico need 2.5% of registered voters, i.e. the adult population, because as you know, you're automatically registered when coming of age to be recognized as such as a party. Finally, Mexico City, again, so as to not go back to the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. For most of its modern history, Mexico City was Mexico DF, the federal district, and it had a case of Washingtonitis, taxation with no representation. And that slowly shifts with the opening of the mayoral office in the 90s, which AMLO was a mayor of, by the way. And it transitioned to full statehood with a rebrand to Ciudad de Mexico, CDMX for short, in the 2010s. So that is...
So it's like DC then? Is that what I'm understanding from that?
Yeah. Like before all these reforms, they were basically a dependency of the presidency.
Okay.
Kind of like Washington is sort of like a dependency of Congress, I guess.
Except if Washington, D.C. was the size of Los Angeles.
Also.
Right.
And now a leftist unionist brief history of Mexico. Again, I will try to be concise with the history so as to give the proletarian struggle its well-deserved spotlight. But we do have to contextualize where said struggle takes place. And finally, by no means comprehensive, and we are skipping some places. And so we start in 1810 with the independence. Like most independence movements from Spanish colonial rule in America, which is a continent, don't at me, it does not start as anti-Spanish or anti-monarchy, but anti-Bonapartiste. The criollo, the local-born children of Spaniards, bourgeois class, doesn't want independence for its own sake, but as a show of loyalty to King Carlos IV that eventually loses its royalist facade to give way to its opportunist core. Remember that the feudal encomienda system that enslaved indigenous and African people under the guise of evangelism is not great. So when the call to arms for independence came, the oppressed indigenous and mestizo campesinos joined in thinking it will earn their subjugation, only to be betrayed when the goals of the owner class were achieved. This, sadly, will be a recurrent motif. First Empire, 1821. So Mexico's independence isn't a straight shot to a liberal democracy. After the war and the ousting of the Spanish, Agustín de Iturbide, a royalist turncoat responsible for the Plan de Iguala, which is considered the first formal declaration of independence of Mexico. Brief aside, Mexican history is littered with plans, but these are not plans. These are declarations. For some reason, they call them plans, which explains why these plans are published all the time in newspapers. And you're like wondering, like, why are they publishing these plans? No, they're declarations. Well, he decides to declare himself Emperor of Mexico and Mexico an empire, only to be ousted a couple years later by López de Santana, another caudillo, a leader of the independence war, after the Plan de Casamata, again, not a declaration, not a plan. Iturbide then is summarily executed via death squad. First Republic, 1825. Guadalupe Victoria, he names himself that because, like he has to represent Mexico as his first president. So he names himself after the Virgin of Guadalupe and Victoria because of victory. But his real name was José Miguel Ramón Audauto Fernández y Félix, the most telenovela name ever. He is elected first president. He would be the only one to see his term through because after him, it follows a 30-year presidential crisis with a lot of coups and stuff. But mostly it's Santa Anna being a rowdy post-independence military guy. Santana, as president, gets into various conflicts, most notably the Guerra de los Pasteles or the Pastry War, the first Franco-Mexican conflict. This war is the result of, I shit you not, a French restaurateur demanding reparations for unpaid goods from Santana's men that escalated into a full-blown blockade. And of course, he's mostly infamously remembered for the Mexican-American War.
I would actually fight on the side of pastries.
Triggered and celiac.
You owe me from the pastry. And then you have war. Like Mexican history is such a... it really is wild. Yeah, I love it. Then, of course, war he's most famous for, or rather infamous, is the Mexican-American War, although simplified to the point of parody by both sides, this war is a complex tapestry that mostly involves negligence, the untamability of the Mexican North, clever property acquisition by Americans in Mexican Texas, an Irish Catholic battalion, the Batallón de San Patricio, that switched sides mid-war, the American invasion of Mexico City, and the taking of the military school. For anyone curious, just Google Mexican boy heroes for some wild nation-building myth and much more.
I'm pretty sure you need to make sure your child safety search is on if you're searching.
Yes. Yeah, that sounds terrifying, honestly. I'm not sure I want to Google that at all.
Well, this all
If you want to
culminates
watch us
in-
Google it, you can donate at our Patreon.
If you want this Google
God.
search, this, of course, culminates in the annexation of Texas, Alta California, known today as just California, and Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, known today as Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Kansas, parts of Colorado, parts of Wyoming, and parts of Oklahoma. Imperialists be imperialists since forever.
Yep.
Second Republic. Of course, Santana, after this defeat, digs his heels even deeper and becomes dictator, which leads to the Plan de Ayutla and later to the Guerra de la Reforma. The reform wars are successful in getting Santana out and making a new, more liberal constitution that furthered secularism, most of all, and eventually leads to the election of Benito Juárez, considered by many to be its first indigenous president, as much as that is possible at the time, given the erasure and genocide of the indigenous since the Conquista. His declaration of non-payment to foreign debtors is what will trigger the Second Mexican Empire. At this point in time, many of the unions in Mexico have their start, or rather the proto-unions. Mutualist groups and co-ops are all the rage during the 1850s. For example, the Sociedad Particular de Socorro Mutuo, which has a mandate to fight modern slavery, so its politics was way ahead of its time. Also of note, the Sociedad de Meseros, the Waiters Guild, which had 5,300 members and gave daily aid to 20 to 25 members. This does not mean that there weren't any unions, rather that these proto-unions were all the rage back then, because you also have rail workers, tram workers, cigar sellers, carpenters, and bakers all beginning to form guilds during this time. Second Mexican Empire, 1863. So Napoleon III had been eyeing establishing some sort of foothold in the New World, and he took the non-payment of debt as an excuse to invade Mexico and establish a European monarch there. He is successful in doing so, except for the Battle of Puebla that happened on May the 5th. Cinco de Mayo, brief parenthesis here, Cinco de Mayo has virtually no celebration in Mexico. Contrary to popular belief, Mexico's Independence Day is September the 15th, not Cinco de Mayo. Mexican Americans began celebrating Mexican resistance from the French in solidarity with their families back in Mexico and never really stopped. And that's how you have, like the modern celebration that is Cinco de Mayo.
Mm.
Maximilian of Habsburg, a devout Catholic Austrian noble, is invited by Napoleon III and the Mexican conservatives, now full-blown monarchists now, because remember, the capitalist class will never, ever be on the side of your country, will be always inside of power. They invite him to become emperor. By most accounts, he was just a noble idiot, basically. The Mexican resistance and Juárez prevailed 5 years later, and Maximilian was executed by firing squad. The other leitmotif of the episode. With the Republic restored, Benito Juárez makes a bunch of reforms, cementing himself as an icon of the Reforma. But seeking re-election in 1871, opportunistic general Porfirio Díaz declares the Plan de la Noria, a political crusade and coup that argued for non-re-election. Juárez reaches his untimely death by non-violent causes, by the way, and Porfirio Díaz would ironically get himself into power and re-elect himself almost for 30 years straight. The Porfiriato, or Porfirio Díaz's dictatorship, 1876. Here's where the real working class history starts. But for context's sake, Porfirio was a liberalish strongman that was big into bringing stability to the owner class in Mexico. These achieved through outside investment, mega projects like the Mexican Railway, and most of all, the oppression of the new underclass of workers. This underclass, of course, created by both conflicts of the Reform and Restoration Wars, in which many campesinos into the cities for the first time and are forced into wage labor, basically. And this oppression, of course, is not limited to that, but also use of military force to call strikes when needed. All this, of course, remembered today by the white-sick well-to-dos with a heavy dose of revisionism as Mexico's Belle Epoque. Also of note, during the Porfiriato are the escape laws, commonly known as Mátenlos en caliente, kill them while they're hot, an extra-legal policy that heavily suggested cops and infantry to release political prisoners during transport and then execute them as they attempted to quote-unquote escape.
And what year, what era is this?
This is 1876.
Oh, shit. Okay.
1870, El Gran Círculo Obreros de México is founded. Though timid in its politics and short-lived, only lasting 10 years, it's the first proper ecumenical worker society. But it did not last, of course. 1876 sees the founding of the first proper workers' union in the Congreso Obrero Mexicano, followed shortly by the Mexican Socialist Party in 1878. There is clear Spanish and Italian anarchist influence in the ideas circulating in both institutions. And most of them are not surprisingly from the campesinos, but from the urban petit bourgeois, who are getting all of this radicalization from abroad. Rail workers, on the other hand, are informed by their interactions with their American colleagues who were all IWW affiliated. And it is through them that they see the benefits of collective bargaining. During this time, we also have many strikes: the barateros, the seller of cheap goods, in 1871, the textile workers in 1872. All those strikes won by the workers, resulting in reduction of the workday and increased wages. The first proper revolutionary strike would happen with the miners of Cananea in 1906. Though violently defeated with many workers dead, this would not be in vain, as it would lead to the founding of the Mexican Liberal Party, strange name for a workers' party, but bear with me, who sought strong secular reforms in education and politics. They would be heavily persecuted, some members even sent to jail in Texas in collaboration with American authorities, and all of this would be prologue to the Mexican Revolution.
So they exported the prisoners to the United States to be held? So they so they would not be... I guess the fear was that they would be freed if they were left in a prison in Mexico, or...
My sources didn't go deep into the reasons.
I see.
But
okay.
I would suspect that it is, both in collaboration with the states, like extradition, sort of like with El Chapo. And also, they wouldn't want, radicals in prison radicalizing further prisoners, which is sort of what happens now in a lot of prisons in Latin America, which, just become headquarters for many groups.
So they weren't sending their best, is what you're saying?
They weren't sending their best at all. or rather, they were sending their best.
They were sending their best.
They were sending their best, anarchist, educated Mexican guys, of course. Revolution, 1910. Again, we could spend a whole episode on the Mexican Revolution, but in the broader strokes, so as to get to the workers' involvement in the struggle, it is a convulsion of interest. First, the need to get Porfirio out and replace him, an effort mostly led by Francisco I. Madero, a political opponent. Then the peasant struggles of Emiliano Zapata, who wanted extensive land reform. And finally, of course, Porfirio Díaz himself struggled to remain in power. This would go on for a decade. It will have an American intervention, several coups, counter-coups, and assassinations. And all will ultimately lead to a series of presidents from the Labor Party, the creation of the Central Bank of Mexico, the PNR, a precursor to the PRI, to the PRI, aka the perfect dictatorship. And during this time, you have the weakened workers joining the causes of Zapata and other revolutionary leaders throughout the country. After the revolution, with the help of some political maneuvering, anti-strike laws are revived to preemptively lead with the emboldened and armed workers. So any sort of continuation of the worker struggle through armed means is sort of quelled. And in 1913, the Congreso Obrero Permanente, the COP, is founded. Not a union or a party, but a civil association looking for, quote unquote, the betterment of workers' lives. As broad as their mandate might be, their red battalions were no joke, and they would contribute to the ousting of Diaz, only to be on the crosshairs immediately after, as they called for general strike, and this would prove to be fatal, as the government response would be crushing. Post-revolution, 1920. Brief aside, in 1918, a workers' conference in Saltillo founds the Confederación Regional Obrera de México, the CROM, the CROM. A reformist association set on achievable goals, orderly strikes, and being as apolitical and anti-Marxist as possible. This political bent is suspected to be the influence of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, an anti-communist union alternative to the CIO that wanted to export its pacifying union alternative abroad.
Boo.
Yeah, boo.
Hate to see it.
And now the AFL and the CIO are one in this
Yeah, we
country.
could do an episode on that.
That's really great. Yeah.
The CROM at the CROM was led by Luis Morones, a true archetypical corrupt union boss, always accompanied by an entourage of gunmen who crushed any dissenting voices in the organization, openly flaunted lavish parties, gifts, and even orgies. Still, with the power of the workers invested in him, regardless of its proper use, became too much of a liability to the owner class. So Morones was gradually ostracized from political life by then President Plutarco Elias Calles, which in turn led to diminishing and deserting membership. The CROM would be taken by the Confederación de Trabajadores de México, the CTM. Boasting big tent views, they were strategically positioned to rally the working class at the CROM's fall. And during President Lázaro Cárdenas' socialist reforms, that, for example, include the nationalization of oil, labor reform, and most importantly, land reform, the effectiveness of the CTM during this time apocryphally lead to even Stalin declaring the obsolescence of the Mexican Communist Party. Emphasis on apocryphal. It was mentioned, but I could not corroborate it with any other source. Another brief parenthesis, the Mexican Communist Party, the brainchild of Bengali intellectual and political refugee M.N. Roy. Sadly for it, the popularity of the CTM at the end of socialist-friendly Cardenism being immediately followed by a slew of American-pressured presidents ready to localize McCarthyism in Mexico led to the party's irrelevance in the years to come. And most ironically of all now, M.N. Roy's house today is a posh EDM club in Mexico City that still bears his name.
Wild.
Yeah. And their website and stuff, they all say, like, in this house, the Mexican Communist Party was founded. But now you can be at the most exclusive club. And I'm like, geez. Never been there. A friend of mine was there. He kind of liked it. He was a posh guy himself.
I think maybe the first Proles Con when we come back should be we burn this place down.
Meet Adam and Roy.
Just kidding. Yeah.
By 1945, the CTM signs a pro-owner class agreement, rolling back decades of workers' victories. In the scramble for a succeeding union, given this delegitimization, the Central Única de Trabajadores, the CUT, and the Unión General Obrera Campesina de México, the UGOCM, are founded, but will not find broad appeal during the decades of heavy anti-communist propaganda that would follow. And then the Priato, which I by no means have coined it, but people sort of refuse to call this era by the fact that that party was in power that whole time, but I'm calling it that. The Priato. So 1929 to 2000. This is the aforementioned perfect dictatorship. The PRM, or Partido de la Revolución Mexicana, later renamed to the Partido Revolución Institucional, PRI, both names an affront to many of the ideals of the Mexican Revolution, will rule Mexico for 70 years. These 7 decades will see the massacre of Tlatelolco in 1968, a student meeting that will end with President Díaz Ordaz ordering the army to execute unarmed students, the Halconazo in 1971. For those who have watched the movie Roma, that's the sort of riot that happens. It is a student protest that it gets infiltrated by U.S.-trained Contra groups, the Halcones, and it results in the murder of 120 people. During this dictatorship, controlled opposition will be done by 2 parties that still exist today, the PRD and the PAN. Liberal parties in opposition to the PRI in name only, as they share many of the conservative politics of them. And also of note, the institutionalization of political asylum in Mexico, best portrayed by the granting of asylum to Trotsky. Again, institutionalization, meaning, it's something that they highly praise about themselves culturally and politically because it's open to anyone.
So what is the actual political makeup of the PRI? What are their goals, or what were their goals, I guess?
During this time is literally just remaining in power.
Okay. Just get in and do nothing. So like the Democratic Party, is that?
Sort of like that. I mean, it's, of course, our Mexican listeners can get into how more complicated this can be, but yeah, they have very pro-American conservative politics that sort of culminate in 94, or the year that lasted 3.
Yeah.
NAFTA. There's a very nice Netflix documentary, although you don't use Netflix. You sail the high seas. It's called 1994. It is a long year because the de facto successor to the presidency, Luis Orlando Colosio, a reformist within the PRI, is assassinated when he's suspected by then President Carlos Salinas. The NAFTA gets signed, which haunts Mexico's economy and health to this day. The armed struggle of the EZLN, the EZLN or Zapatistas, starts and kind of ends successfully with the granting of autonomy of several parts in the state of Chiapas. And finally, this all ends in the year 2000 with the election of the PAN's candidate, Vicente Fox, the first non-PRI president in over 70 years.
Just like, I guess, for listeners who aren't familiar with this period, I guess going back to World War II, there was something called the Bracero program, which was because so many people from the United States were fighting in World War II, they allowed somewhat unrestricted immigration across the border to take care of farm work. And people would travel back and forth. They may work for one season and then go home and never return, or they may stay for years and then return. But because of the economic disparity between the US and Mexico, some of these people became what was more or less wealthy and were able to buy substantial plots of land in Mexico with the money they made during the Bracero program. And they established internal agricultural products, primarily growing Mexican corn in Mexico. And when NAFTA was signed, Mexico was flooded with U.S. agricultural products, again, primarily subsidized corn products, which completely decimated that sector of the Mexican economy, which then contributed, because there were tons and tons and tons of agricultural workers in Mexico who then lost their jobs because the owners of these, moderate sized farms who had been, it had been like their grandfather's farm that he had bought again when he made money in the US under the Bracero program. So that is a reason for a lot of the pickup in, undocumented workers crossing the border into the United States in the mid to late 90s was as a direct result of NAFTA.
All right. Now we're going to talk about Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, as he's called. He was born November 13th, 1953. Scorpio King, we love to see it, in the state of Tabasco. Both of his parents were merchants, and he came from pretty humble beginnings. He was the oldest of 7 siblings, and he grew up helping his parents in their shop. When he was 15 years old, his younger brother died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head that is said to have been an accident. Understandably, people who knew him growing up said that this had a big impact on AMLO's personality and the rest of his childhood. When he finished high school at the age of 19, he began a degree in politics at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM, in Mexico City. He studied for a few years and then took time away from school to begin his political career in his home state of Tabasco. At this time, he was aligned with the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI. AMLO took an interest in politics and specifically in indigenous rights and representation, especially that of the Chontal Maya. That would be the indigenous community that was most prominent in his hometown. That is a name, the Chontal Maya is a name that is given to them. They self-identify as the Yoko Yinicab. And he worked as director of the Indigenous Institute of Tabasco for 5 years, from 1977 to 82. By 83, so he's about 30 at this time, he actually becomes the head of the PRI in the state of Tabasco. But in the late 80s, he leaves this party, the PRI, to join the PRD. Babe, do you want to tell a little bit about the difference between the PRI and the PRD?
Sure. So again, like the PRD and the PAN end up being a sort of controlled opposition during the Priato. But if there's meaningful difference between the two is that, the PRI, as calcified within power, it's very conservative and extremely anti-worker, whereas the PRD has a more conciliatory politics in opposition to the PRI.
Hey there, Martín from Beyond the Edit here. I just wanted to add a more nuanced comparison of the 3 opposition parties in Mexico. In practical terms, they're pretty much interchangeable, but there are some key differences that paint a fuller picture. First, the PRI, which started out as a social democrat party, but in seeking more alignment with the US, and the 80s being the 80s, they are now a full-blown neoliberal party. They are an ideological chameleon, adapting to whatever is more convenient politically at the time, and during their stay in power, the politics of the sitting president. The PAN, on the other hand, was an opposition party during the PRI's 7-decade hegemony. They are ideologically further right than the PRI, an already right-leaning party since the late 70s. They are really into family values type bigotry that excludes anyone not straight or white or affluent, allegedly. Finally, there's the PRD, which is the furthest left of the mainstream parties in Mexico. It's even a member of the Socialist International. They seek to move Mexico away from neoliberalism, and also spout all the usual diversity and integration you would hear from most liberal parties. And yet, they are part of the anti-Morena coalition along the PRI and the PAN.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. AMLO runs for governor in the state of Tabasco twice, and he's unsuccessful both
Spicy.
Stupid.
But by 1996, and Jesus Christ, but by 1996, but by 1996 and through 1999, he becomes the PRD party president. And the reason that I share this is, although not in the way that we would say it in the States, he's not some kind of like dynastic political pseudo-royalty. But in his own way, you can see he's clearly a career politician, and he's someone who's really interested in engaging in party politics. During this time, while he's the PRD party president, he organizes a bunch of protests throughout the state of Tabasco against the oil giant Pemex. So if you've ever been to Mexico, you see Pemex gas stations just absolutely everywhere. Because a lot of their extraction was taking place in his home state, the state of Tabasco. And obviously, like oil spills, the sort of general chaos of extraction, it was causing a lot of ecological damage. It was doing harm to local fishermen and the fishing industries. Because if you're not familiar with Mexican geography, Tabasco is a coastal state. While it's likely that his concern for the environment and for his home state was sincere, it's also clear that he used this cause to further his political career, because the protests start receiving national attention and sparks really intense conversations because AMLO appears on national television just covered in blood after getting into a physical altercation with the police during the protests. Another thing that I find quite interesting, especially for maybe American listeners, is this thing that AMLO does that we don't see often in the US, which is sort of finding the intersection of worker rights and autonomy and environmental impact. Right? Often it's assumed in the US, despite, actual evidence, that working people like aren't in favor of environmental reform. So we see AMLO here appealing to like just regular working people while still having a relatively environment forward agenda, or at least that's how it appears. We'll get into it. Finally, in the year of our Lord, 2000, he becomes the mayor of Mexico City, which is still today, but absolutely at that time, a place with huge environmental problems, right? It's an enormous city. According to reports, though, at the time in the early 2000s, please get ready for this, 600 tons, 600 tons of, guess, 600 tons of what was entering the city's air every day?
Shrimp.
You were honestly so close. The correct answer is fecal dust.
Oh,
600 tons of fecal dust, guys, poop particles entering the air every single day. Because
I'm not a scientist, but that sounds like a lot of poop.
That is too much poop.
Maybe
for the
too
air.
much poop. Maybe too much
That's
poop
some
for the
shit.
air. Yeah.
We could do an episode on.
Stop
We could do an
it.
episode on it.
We could do a whole episode on shit.
On the Great Mexican Shit Cloud. Oh, fuck.
600 tons of fecal dust entered the city's air every single day because literally millions, about 3 million residents, literally 3 million residents were living without a sewage system. So you can see that the work that he was doing in Tabasco really appealed, right, to the people of Mexico City. And he becomes the second ever democratically elected mayor, and he's elected despite not meeting the typical 5-year residency requirement. He only wins by less than a point. It's a really narrow win, but he definitely becomes a part of that like late 90s, early 2000s turn to like celebrity mayors, right? Obviously, we know about Giuliani. Later, we get Boris Johnson, you know, the type guys who like make major city mayors like the hip, cool thing. And while he's in office, he maintains a very high level of popular support, and largely because of certain social programs that he implements that assist single mothers, children, students, disabled people, and the elderly. He also opens a new public university and a bunch of high schools. These are all kinds of things that he later implements in a broader way when he's the president. He pushes back, at least rhetorically, against the so-called like Washington consensus. And these actions really solidify his reputation among progressives, as well as a lot of working people, as someone who can be like trusted to take Mexico in the right direction. He's said to be hardworking, honest, humble, and a good leader. However, he receives pushback from environmental groups who voted for him, by the way, because of his previous interest in at least what looked like environmental causes, specifically because he's not really able to uphold his promises, especially those regarding the environment. Because a lot of his, oh man, what a wild time to be alive, the early 2000s. A lot of his quote unquote environmental proposals center around building new highways.
Oh.
So at this time, it's important to note, first cameo, our current environmental secretary is none other than Claudia Sheinbaum, the current Morena party candidate for the upcoming election. So we'll get to her later, but she's got a PhD in energy engineering. She's got a background in physics, but somehow, for some reason, at this moment in time, their proposed solution for the horrific air quality in Mexico is to have more cars on the road.
I have questions.
And I don't have answers. So for those who are unfamiliar with Mexico City's geography, it's got pretty high altitude. It's 2,240 meters, which is about 7,300 feet. For some contrast, if you're American, Boulder is 1,655 meters, so much lower, or 5,400 feet, more or less, above sea level. But Mexico City, even though it sits at that altitude, it's actually a valley that used to be a lake.
Yeah, it's more or less the same as Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs is like 6,800 feet above sea level, and it also sits in a valley. If you head east, elevation gain. If you head west, elevation gain. And it's because this used to be a sea, an inland sea back, I don't know, 50 million years ago. I forget.
Back in the day, we were all there.
Back in the day, yeah. Well, I was anyway.
So it's built upon a former Aztec capital. And so, like, as with any valley, right, it runs the risk of any kind of air contamination, especially if there are pollutants like carbon emissions, right? The craziest part of this is that Mexico City already had a relatively robust subway network that's been open since, I think, 1969. So there's already existing infrastructure that could have been invested in. Also, the highways he constructed were sort of like double-decker highways, you know, the highways that are like on top of existing highways, which isn't ideal because Mexico City is an area that has pretty frequent and devastating earthquakes.
And also built in a lake. So the soil there isn't particularly strong. And more to the point, the project is called the Segundo Piso. So the second floor, they made a highway, and then they made another highway on top. And then the proposal is, in that elevated highway, what if we added more highway?
Whoa. Yo, dog, I heard you like highways. So I put a highway in your highway. I got all the current references. Yeah, totally.
So we see here this sort of like populist tendency that we're going to see more of as time goes on. The reason that I share about the highway on highway action is here's AMLO building these highways leading up to his announcement for the presidential run, right? Appealing not to the working people that he's been working so hard to sort of build trust with, but obviously what class of people in a city that big drive cars and take highways, right? Like more affluent people. Keep in mind, obviously now we see that sort of echelon of people as being environmentally conscious, at least rhetorically, but in the early 2000s, like that was just less so the case. Mexico, as you guys may have heard, is known for crime, especially cartel violence, disappearances, kidnapping, extortion, and AMLO inherits this legacy of violence that he needs to contend with in the city. And he hires none other than friend of the pod and sponsor of this episode, Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York, to reduce crime in Mexico City.
Stop and frisk.
Yes. Broken windows. Yeah. Good. Great.
Along with that, all these like celebrity mayorfluencers getting together, right? Mayorfluencers have to protect each other. You know what I'm saying? They're a special class of people.
Yeah.
Along with that, he takes a very liberal, pejorative approach to housing, which sort of lays the foundation for a lot of the housing crisis and gentrification that we see in Mexico City today by liberalizing zoning laws and allowing these huge numbers of new building projects in high-income neighborhoods. Tragically, in 2003, his first wife died, I believe, from complications of lupus. But in the following 2 years, there's a pretty significant win for AMLO, which is when he opens the Metrobus project in 2005, right at the tail end of his time in office. But the course of true love never did run smooth. So since day one, although, as I've said, he's clearly no Che Guevara, those further to the right have always felt threatened by AMLO's rise. So before the opening of the Metrobus project in May of 2004, court proceedings are filed against him for allegedly violating a court order actually related to one of the aforementioned highways. This is significant because this impeachment would have barred him from running for president. But in August, there are huge protests calling for charges to be dropped. And in May of 2005, the following year, the charges are dropped, which allow AMLO to go ahead with his first presidential campaign. 2006, by the way, he marries his second wife. She's really quite interesting, but we don't have time to cover her. And he faces another highly contested election, but ultimately he loses. By the way, another highly contested election happened in the 80s where a left-wing candidate was in the lead all the way until the end. And then suddenly the voting systems failed. And then again in 1994, a candidate who aligned himself with the rights and causes of Indigenous people, women, and children was fatally shot while campaigning. So even if there was fraud or voter suppression, Calderon, the guy who beat AMLO, still only wins by about 0.6%. So it's a very, very, very narrow win. There's later an allegation, by the way, that in this election, one of AMLO's closest advisors accepts $2 million in campaign funds from cartels. It's a really interesting story. I wish I had time to talk more about it. A little quote from ProPublica. In return for a promise that López Obrador administration would facilitate the traffickers' criminal operations. Although, big if true, right? It's unclear whether or not AMLO was even aware of it. He runs again in 2012. He loses again. And he's got a strong suspicion that there was more voter fraud. But he files a legal challenge to the election results, and the Electoral Tribunal uphold the results, and the PRI candidate Nieto becomes president. After his electoral loss, he decides, because really...
Really quickly, I've noticed that the United States didn't intervene in Mexico's elections when there were questions about voter fraud. Is that possibly because the candidate they wanted to win won?
Allegedly.
Allegedly.
After his second electoral loss, he decides to do his favorite thing, which is throw a party. And by that, I mean a political party. He leaves the PRD and forms his own party, Morena, the National Regeneration Movement. However, Morena is not just an acronym. It also has a meaning. Martín, you want to talk about what that word means for listeners who might not know?
Yeah, so Morena is the female version of brown skin. So Mexico being a deeply, deeply colorist country, and one that has actually sort of grappled with the legacy of mestizaje, or of mixed racedness, which is sort of the legacy of colonial times. The moniker of Moreno and Morenidad, sort of brown skinnedness, has become, a flag of many peoples that include mixed race people who are not aligned with Mexican whiteness or are not white, and also working people in general, because again, you go to Mexico, and even though many people are brown skinned, you see ads, you see actors, you see everyone just being white as hell.
Yeah.
So Morena, the name is not coincidental. It appeals to that base, and it also, pays a kind of lip service to the movement of Morenidad.
which on one hand is a kind of elegant way of handling the concept of mestizaje. And rather than leaning on something like one's blood quantum, it's just going off of how you look. On the other hand, the limitations of that obviously are that it also serves to erase people who still identify more with their indigenous heritage than they do with a sort of general Mexican culture, if that makes sense. So I just want to put that here because it matters later. In the early days of Morena as a party, the public had a very negative view and nobody wanted to join the party because the critique was that it was sort of like splintering the left. We'll see soon here, but Mexico has like a really long history of building these like broad coalitions between parties. And so if like AMLO is striking out on his own, it's just seen as sort of divisive. But AMLO really pushes back against this. And he says that the PRD betrays the Mexican people and that they're going to try to raise taxes for regular people, that they're trying to increase the price of oil. And he thinks that they're going to try to pave the way for the privatization of the oil industry, which had already been done in Mexico to a certain extent. And AMLO has always been a long supporter of making resources like oil, minerals, and electricity public and state-owned. In 2014, the INE formally recognizes Morena as its own party, and it's able to run candidates in the 2015 election, which is legislative, not presidential. In 2018, third time's a charm, and he runs for president again, this time representing Morena, as well as two smaller parties, the Labor Party, which is known as the PT, and the socially conservative party, the Social Encounter Party. Again, bridging what, at least in America, people think of as this sort of like left and right causes to create a broad appeal. And it works because he wins 53% of the votes. And this is a four-way race. So it's a really significant victory. And for comparison, most other Mexican presidents come in with around like 40%. Congratulations.
Almost two Joe Bidens.
Yeah.
Almost two Bidens.
It's about two Bidens of power. Yes.
Wow. That's pretty significant.
I think now that we're going to look at his time in office, the best description of AMLO is that he is a center-left nationalist populist moving toward nationalist development capitalism. And that comes from someone called Professor Edwin F. Ackerman, whose analysis I don't always agree with. I think it's too generous. But I think that assessment is really spot on. By the way, if you like read about AMLO in English in like Jacobin or something, a lot of it is written by him. He does a lot of journalistic work on this topic. So Morena is a super young party, right? It's only officially recognized in 2014, 4 years before the election. And even according to the pretty glowing Jacobin article, the first 2 years in particular were a missed opportunity in terms of building up the party with ambitious initiatives like the political education of cadres not coming to fruition. And I want to highlight that because as we're examining this through a revolutionary Marxist lens, it's a reminder that there's just always a struggle when it comes to raising the political consciousness. Okay, to describe AMLO's political vision, it's what he calls the fourth transformation. The first is 1810 independence. The second is Benito Juarez, reform of church and state. The third is the Mexican Revolution. And the fourth is nonviolent. It's democratic and peaceful. He also boldly declares that neoliberalism is done. The fourth transformation is what he identifies as Mexican humanist that prioritizes private investment, free trade, wealth for Mexican people, but that gives the states the responsibility of giving rights to the people. And these rights would include education, healthcare, a place to live, a pension, and that energy and mineral rights should be state maintained. And he mostly sticks to this, as does Claudia, his successor, at least so far. So again, as you can see here, my critique isn't even necessarily of AMLO, like he's fine. Well, sometimes my critique is of AMLO. For the most part, he's fine and he's doing what he said he was going to do. My critique is of the way that I think that he is kind of wrongfully compared to a lot of much further left figures, because this is what he says he's going to do and this is what he did, right? So you can see he wants to reform things and reforms help, but he's not a socialist. But he does a lot of things that win people over very quickly. So one of the things that he says when he first gets into office is there can be no rich government and poor people. So, oh my God, he tries to sell this private jet for $200,000 that one of his predecessors bought, but nobody.
The presidential airplane.
Yes, he tries to sell this presidential airplane that one of his predecessors bought, and he was like, no, I don't need this. I'll fly commercial. But then nobody buys it, and he tries to put it up for auction, and like no one will like buy this fucking airplane. And so,
and then he tries to try to sell it with the national lottery. So again,
is this the beginning of Proles Air?
Is he going to put it on eBay next?
Yeah. No. It ended up. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I think it has finally, been sold.
He is also usually seen driving an old Volkswagen, which has a lot of cultural significance, by the way, because Volkswagen has like quite a history in Mexico. I think it's like still the largest or one of the largest employers in the city of Puebla. And Mexicans like really have a soft spot for Volkswagens, especially older VWs. And here from an article in the Autonomous University of Social Movements in 2022, he renames this government agency. Okay. The Institute for Returning to the People What Was Stolen. He auctioned several $1 million of Lamborghinis, Corvettes, and other ostentatious vehicles used by previous administrations or seized from drug dealers. López Obrador also took a 40% pay cut, reduced many high-level government salaries, canceled presidential pensions, and abolished the Presidential Guard, a 2,000-strong elite military force tasked with protecting high-level officials and international guests.
I mean, honestly, pretty based.
It's super based, and immediately he's showing, right, to the people in a pretty, charismatic way that he is a break from the previous administration. Another thing that he does is that when he takes office, he inherits this project to build Mexico City a new airport. My personal opinion, by the way, is that Mexico City is an awful and really disorganized airport. It really should have been replaced. Many airports in the country are much nicer. Anyway, when the project is 20% finished and 60% contracted, he put it to a vote and goes ahead and cancels the airport according to the results, which again cements him as this guy who really listens to the people. But as Martín mentioned before, elections aren't compulsory, and the turnout was just over 1% of voters.
Damn.
And this also sets us up to talk about how the new airport of Mexico City is actually a military base. We'll talk about that later. One of the most notable things that he did that got a lot of support is direct cash payments to elders and some other marginalized groups. Like I said, an extension of what he did as mayor. So when I say direct cash payments, he pays a group of workers about like $500 or $600 a month, which is above minimum wage, and we'll get into that too, to physically go around the country and like give people money. It's not a huge amount of money, but it does make a difference, and it goes a long way in getting working people and elders to support his presidency. He also gives a lot of students scholarships or stipends for high school and university. So in a 2020 speech, he says, Article 4 of the Constitution has already been amended to make support for the elderly and for children with disabilities, as well as the granting of scholarships to students from poor families and free medical care and medicines, a priority and obligatory social right. From now on, the government must comply with this mandate, regardless of the party in office. This is not an expense, but an investment. And the crowd goes wild when he says that. It is not a gift, it is justice. He goes on to say, previously, young people were turned away and discriminated against. Now they are guaranteed the right to education and employment. They are now scholarship students or apprentices hired at minimum wage so they can train and get ahead. Understandably, these programs are hugely popular, but it's also worth noting that they're not completely new, and some version of them has been implemented by previous neoliberal governments as well. In addition to those gains, a lot of daycare programs, women's shelters, and elder care are defunded. He says it's because of corruption and that he could just give the money directly to people, but people rightly had the criticism of like, okay, well, if I'm a woman in a dangerous situation, what do I do to get AMLO to come like hand me money, right? Like many people in those kinds of situations struggle to access the resources. And if the locations for them to go are not available, this presents a huge problem, right? Regarding unions, which Martín mentioned earlier, before Morena, the labor unions were completely dependent on the PRI because the PRI controlled like the main labor federation. AMLO's victory disrupts that. And okay, I'm going to say streamline, but I'm saying streamline the process in a already very bureaucratic system. So making a somewhat less cumbersome process for forming new unions. Independent union organizing ends up being much lower than what those on the left hope, but technically the super bureaucratic process becomes moderately bureaucratic. Another thing that AMLO does is propose a 40-hour work week. So a lot of people in the United States, or at least outside of Mexico, don't know that currently it's a 48-hour, 6-day work week. The legislation has not passed. It's just sort of languishing somewhere in the ether, but he did propose the reduction to a 40-hour work week, and he raised the minimum wage by 20% at first and then basically doubled it. Again, those statistics sound staggering, but to be clear, currently, the minimum wage is 249 Mexican pesos a day, which works out to about $14 a day. So that's $336 a month if you're working the standard 6-day work week. And yes, I know so many Americans talk about how cheap Mexico is, but to give you some idea of the cost of things, a tank of gas for just like a normal car that's a few years old is about 1,400 Mexican pesos, or about $82. And a day's worth of basic food ingredients, or like kind of street food-ish for one person, would be about $6. Add to that, a lot of these lower wage jobs are in construction, right? Which means moving around, paying for transportation and housing. And so like, yes, it's an increase. And I want to underline that working people were really in favor of it. But these people are not largely living any kind of stable, comfortable life. Another cool thing, though, that AMLO did is crack down on bosses screwing their workers out of something that's called their PTU, which is basically like a profit-sharing scheme that's supposed to be available to workers. He didn't start it. It was already in process. But again, historically, the owning class has always found like loopholes around it. And so even though it ends up being still a modest sum of money, the percent of the increase of the payments has been like 109%. Another thing he's not been able to put through, but is still trying to finalize, is changing the pension reforms. But he's receiving a lot of pushback. So in 1997, basically Mexican pensions were converted to like individual accounts to make them more like a 401k, for example, and workers and employers would both be contributing. But this presents a huge problem, right? Because even worse than in the American system where it's already pretty ineffective, because estimates suggest that somewhere between like 40 and 60% of the Mexican economy is informal labor, right? So there's no like double contribution. They're getting paid cash in hand. So AMLO developed a plan where the unclaimed pensions, let's say you retired later or you moved abroad or you were wealthy and didn't want your, who knows? The unclaimed pensions would be put into a sort of communal account and distributed among people whose pensions were insufficient. He also said that if you did retire later and still wanted your pensions, you'd be able to claim it. But obviously there was like some right criticism that was just like, don't give poor people money. But also some valid criticism, again, was that this process was already incredibly cumbersome and bureaucratic, and that the added steps might hurt people that it was supposed to help. That said, there was a noted reduction of poverty. According to the Coneval, which is like the National Council for the Evaluation of Social Development Policy, from 2018 to 2022, the poverty rate declined from basically half the population to 43.5%. So kind of significant in just a few years, in 4 years. And the multidimensional poverty level decreased from about 42% to about 36% of the total population. Multidimensional poverty, by the way, is like a unique metric used in Mexico too, and I quote, measure poverty not only in terms of income levels, but also in terms of the deprivation of social rights. So to summarize, right, like these reforms are very real and they're very popular with working people, but they are just that, reforms. I don't want to discount the popularity, but again, looking at this through a Marxist lens, I mean, I think we can agree that this is not a person who's interested in divesting from a capitalist mode of production. Yes?
Yeah, a lot of these feel like, at least as an outsider, a lot of them feel like publicity stunts more than like actual effective measures, like just in the way that it seems structured, like the pension thing, right? There are like probably a dozen smarter ways to do that, but the way that he structured it, worded it, is something that people are like, oh yeah, I know that happens. Therefore, all this money pooled into this that we can then like, it's something that your average person can look at and be like, oh yeah, I understand that.
Absolutely. It relies on, again, I'm really so glad that you like, Justin, if nobody's told you this lately, you're just like a very smart person.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. But it relies on exactly like what you're saying, these gaps in class consciousness, these gaps in people being able to understand or having access to just thinking about different ways of things being structured. So based on their assumptions of how things have always been and things already are, it's these sort of like stopgap measures, which like ultimately are sort of the neoliberal playbook, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just being presented in a way that, like you said, feels really intuitive for people, feels like it totally makes sense for people. And picking up the like dropped balls of the past and being like, here you go, goes a long way. And kind of like I said before, you know, I don't want to discredit the consciousness or the awareness or the capacity of an entire country and an entire class of people. But like I said at the top of this episode, I do think that it's just worth examining the pacifying nature of this kind of like reformist presidency.
Yeah, and I mean, this like goes across all countries, cultures, everything towards working people that are struggling like so much that they will take anything, right? And then people take advantage of that.
Yeah.
And they're already literally, again, a 6-day, 48-hour work week is the norm. I mean, yes, in a lot of the informal sectors, but also for a lot of what we would think of like more professional managerial class jobs, also often go in for a half or a full day on the weekends. And so you already have this like overworked, underpaid population that doesn't have a lot of time to process this. And then somebody comes to your house and is like, here, have some money, or here, take some money for grandma. And I mean, there was like so many touching pieces of media that went around about like, I mean, they really like, I teared up seeing them, you know, like grandmas and grandpas feeling like, oh, I could go to the store by myself and buy my grandkids a toy or take them out for an ice cream or something, when they felt like since their non-formal retirement, right, since their time beyond which they were no longer able to work, suddenly they felt like they had some sense of agency, like they were still able to contribute to their family. And it like really meant a lot to people, even though it's actually just like a very modest kind of stopgap.
Yeah. And it's not nothing. It's not nothing, but it is, you know, we could do better, people.
Yeah. So I guess maybe what's a bit terrifying here is that, of course, you've explained like the usefulness of these programs, but also that they're stopgap measures to a large degree. Is that, at least from the media that I've consumed, it appears that the U.S. Is very much anti-AMLO and against his program and his project for the country. So they're so against these just stopgap measures, as opposed to like, you know, we're not even talking about revolution here or anything like that, right? So
yeah, I mean that's fucking.
You're like, don't get any ideas. Don't give grandma $5.
Yeah, I mean the U.S. State Department under friend of the show Hillary Clinton murdered a labor organizer in Honduras over a minimum wage increase from 46 cents to 55, I think, something like that. You know, I mean, fucked up.
I do want to talk about one of AMLO's more based decisions, which centers around Evo Morales. So if we take a look at Mexico's relationships to other countries, especially socialist or left-leaning countries, you can see he tends to support these kinds of projects, right? And in 2019, Evo Morales, who is an indigenous socialist who served as president of Bolivia from 2006 to 2019, and he's basically ousted by friend of the pod, US-backed coups. He fled to Mexico, and AMLO allowed him to seek asylum, saying that he was a victim of a coup d'etat, and Morales said that AMLO saved his life. So that was based.
Fair.
Yeah, and so sorry. Also, from what I understand, he's quite a supporter of, I mean, most sane people in the world are supporters of ending the embargo against Cuba as well.
We get to it.
So it seems like okay, perfect. It seems that he does have these like, you know, international bona fides in terms of supporting leftist governments.
We're going to talk about this like kind of in this section, but I think that you're right, Tony. And that said, I think that a lot of leftists and a lot of socialists and communists broadly, we are so starved for hope that I think that we misinterpret the reason underneath this. I don't want to go too into this, right? Because as a materialist, I'm not in the business of trying to guess his intentions, but I do think, and we'll see it here, I mean, I think that there's a solid case for it. This is motivated by nationalism and his belief in other countries having the right to national sovereignty, and not necessarily because he particularly likes communism or socialism. It's mostly because more he likes death to American imperialism.
Which is based extremely
exactly. And that's what, right, kind of what I was saying at the top of the show is that we can see the value in sovereignty for individual countries, even if they don't intend to steer their governments in a left direction.
Yeah.
So speaking of US-backed coups, Porfirio Diaz, friend of the pod, once said that Mexico is so far from God and so close to the United States. And the two countries have a very uneasy codependence, the US being Mexico's largest trading partner. And in some ways, current Mexican foreign policy isn't that much different from previous administrations, but AMLO comes in to the presidency on this sort of like anti-American and especially like anti-Trump rhetoric, calling him erratic, pushing against America's sort of like anti-immigrant stance, and obviously pushing back against especially Trump's like racist and totally extreme anti-Mexican stance. Although, right, they meet several times, obviously, and the general consensus is that their relationship like improves. They get compared to each other a lot, although I don't really think that's founded, except for like Trump is one kind of nationalist and AMLO is like another kind of nationalist. I don't know. At one point, he thanks Trump, and this is kind of what I was saying earlier, Tony, for, and I quote, because he never sought to impose anything that violates or undermines Mexican sovereignty. So obviously we could have a 10-part series on the US-Mexico relationship alone, but one of the more significant things I think is worth talking about during AMLO's time in office is the way that the southern Mexican border essentially functions as an extension of the US border, which, while we're talking about his sort of self-identity as being a nationalist, I think sort of challenges that, right? If he's allowing his military to essentially serve US political agendas. But as you all may have heard, a lot of asylum seekers from the rest of Central and South America are trying to make it to the United States, but they get detained, often for months on end, at the southern Mexican border. So, oh my gosh, I wish someone could just like explain to AMLO what the climate like is, but apparently no one has yet. In an effort to partner with the United States to find alternatives for the migrants to work and make a life in Mexico so they don't have to go to America, he proposes this like tree planting program in 2021 that he calls planting life or sowing life for quote unquote reforestation. It costs over $1 billion. And it also replaces already existing forests, actually existing forests, with literally fruit trees and timber trees, like commercial agriculture that is intended to be cut down. And monocrops what was already like a biodiverse region. And there are also accounts of certain farmers who maybe had land that hadn't been farmed yet, and they sell their existing woodland, untouched, pristine woodland, basically in exchange for like a $12 monthly stipend. Where really, again, as we were talking earlier about workers just like taking what they could get, we shouldn't have farmers in a situation choosing between modest short-term poverty relief and like ecological destruction.
Again, kind of back to the like ideas that are really understandable and easy to look at and be like, oh yeah, this is great, but don't actually make much sense. And
surprisingly, everybody, please sit down and clutch your pearls. This project actually does not solve the migration issues.
Whoa.
Honestly, it baffles me. No materialist explanation. I'm sure,
materials can't explain this.
Materials.
Marx was wrong.
$12, the end of history. I'm sure many of you remember the migrant caravan of roughly 7,000 people marching together at the end of 2023 to protest their mistreatment and to demand their rights to seek asylum. Several are offered documents to stay in Mexico. However, many are, as I said before, just detained. Some of the paperwork isn't what was promised. And even those who are able to stay in Mexico, entering at that southern part of Mexico in states like Oaxaca and Chiapas, these are some of the poorer regions of the country, and they already have really high unemployment rates and rates of poverty. So while the border conditions, though, are terrible and disgusting, AMLO has at least tried to use Mexico's participation in the border as a bargaining chip, including trying to facilitate talks to end or minimize sanctions against Venezuela and Cuba. He's also repeatedly said that the U.S. needs to get to the root cause of the reasons that people are seeking asylum and pressured the United States to also allow more Mexican people to remain in the United States. So even if he's not a communist, he's certainly an anti-interventionalist and an anti-imperialist and someone who respects state sovereignty. And so this would be an example of some occasions where he stands in solidarity with socialists from Cuba and other parts of South America. That said, regarding his role in militarizing the southern Mexican border and interfering with migrants reaching the United States, AMLO has upheld his end of the bargain, more or less, right? Because at the end of last year, it was like the highest rate of border crossing into the US. I think it was like between 225,000 and 250,000 people within 1 month. But it
Biden
dropped.
did this.
Biden did this. But it
did
dropped to about half. Human Rights Watch, on the other hand, repeatedly petitioned the administration to just stop complying with these measures because the conditions are horrific and dangerous and bleak, but also trying to urge AMLO to stand up to the US and to stop doing its bidding. By contrast, the US, for its part, as of April 2024, just reimposed sanctions onto Venezuela, right? Because there was a brief period from last October where some of the sanctions were temporarily eased, and that sort of expired. And the US was like, no, put it back. Another contentious topic at the border is drug trafficking, with fentanyl sparking the most conversations in recent years. And the US accusing Mexico of bringing the fentanyl, right, into the United States, and AMLO repeatedly asserting that more fentanyl reaches the United States and Canada than reaches Mexico, and still that a lot of the raw materials are not coming from any of these places.
Sure.
That said, for all his talk of being un-American and anti-American and anti-neoliberal, from 2018, right, the year that he was elected, after a lot of public humming and hawing, he agrees to the sort of dressed up NAFTA, the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which goes into effect in 2020. And again, a little quote here from the Autonomous University of Social Movements. Like NAFTA, the USMCA institutionalized the free flow of goods and money across borders while strictly controlling the movement of people. It commits signatories to abide by the IMF exchange rate standards and prevents subsidies for state-owned enterprises. It's not clear how Mexico will square this with increased subsidies to Pemex, both central elements in the neoliberal Bible that limits the role of the state in economic affairs. It contains language making it virtually impossible for either Canada or Mexico to sign trade agreements with China, further hitching Mexico's economic development to the U.S. neoliberal capitalism.
Boo.
Death to America.
Death to America.
In terms of some other more recent global affairs, AMLO rules out pretty much immediately cutting diplomatic ties with Israel in November of 2023. Unlike, right, we see a break here with other leftist countries in the region like Colombia, Honduras, Chile, and Bolivia. Yes, he calls for a ceasefire and he calls for a quote-unquote two-state solution. He condemns Hamas and he urges Israel not to kill civilians. And again, in January of this year, yes, Mexico joins Chile to request the investigation from the ICC, but AMLO still says he's not taking sides.
Sorry, guys. I was just clapping a few minutes ago, but I retract that now after hearing what he said about Hamas.
Yeah.
Similarly, in regards to Russia and Ukraine, AMLO has said that Mexico strives for neutrality and that Mexico has, quote, relationships with all the countries in the world. But he's also criticized the U.S. for giving so much money and support to Ukraine when so many of the projects and proposals in the Americas go ignored or underfunded. And then, before moving on from global AMLOisms, we have to talk about Ecuador. In December of last year, a former lefty vice president of Ecuador, Jorge Glass, faces 2 corruption charges and is sentenced to a pretrial detention. He's obviously like, fuck that. That's not going to be fair. If they're trying to put me in detention before I even go on trial, I'm out. And he seeks asylum in the Mexican embassy. In April of this year, Martín, do you want to tell what happens next?
Yeah. So again, Mexico has a great institutional tradition of asylum that notable non-friend of the podcast, Trotsky, was part of.
Enemy of the podcast.
Any of the podcast Trotsky was a part of. And so the current Ecuadorian president, Daniel Noboa, which is literally a trust fund baby.
A banana billionaire, literally among the Banana Republic elites.
Yeah, son of Álvaro Noboa, Ecuador's only billionaire. And brief note, what happens in banana plantations in Ecuador and a lot of Latin America is modern slavery. There are people there who haven't been censed, who don't have ID cards, who just have a name and work for a company. And that's their identity. And that is, and in the backs of those people and in their labor is that he has billions. Álvaro Noboa is Ecuador's Rose Perot. He has lost count of how many times he has run for president. And in the end, he ends up living his dream vicariously through his son, who runs as this sort of tepid conciliatory guy. And immediately upon taking office, sort of tries to run the Bukele playbook. For those of you who don't know, like Bukele, president of El Salvador, who's like the millennial strongman of the century. And he does this with none of the charisma or the marketing chops. So one of these shows of force that he tries to do against, the sort of, I wouldn't call it red regime, but like pink regime of Correa and Jorge Glass, he goes after Glass in the embassy. So I don't know which convention precisely is the one that he violates, but...
Oh, several of them. The Vienna Convention, the Geneva Convention. He's violating all the conventions.
All the conventions, yeah. But in one of those conventions, it is mentioned that any sort of personnel from the host government cannot enter if not given permission by the chief of the mission. This is, of course, deliberately abstract. So anybody who's in charge is the chief of the mission. He tries to go around this by declaring the ambassador of Mexico to Ecuador persona non grata. So he says, like, there's no chief of the mission now, but bullshit. Like, if there's someone, like, if there's a secretary left
if
there,
there's a janitor left in the embassy, then that's the guy in charge.
He's the chief of the mission, and he has the authority to authorize or not someone entering, like, literally foreign soil according to convention. So he does away with that and purposely raids the embassy with police force to get glass and injures like some embassy personnel during that. This leads to the breaking of diplomatic relationships between Mexico and Ecuador, between Colombia and Ecuador.
Wait, so he gets glass, by the way. He gets glass. And currently, at the time of this recording, he is on a hunger strike in prison, right? And so obviously this is a big issue. Even the countries who are excited to watch Ecuador take this like sharp right political turn, nobody supports this because the precedent obviously is unacceptable. And as Martin said, it violates a bunch of international law. AMLO retaliates by, like you said, dissolving diplomatic relationships with Ecuador and takes Ecuador to the ICJ requesting that Ecuador be removed from the UN. So that's in process there. But everybody get in our time machines and we're going to go back a few years ago to the start of COVID. But according to the WHO, who conveniently just like stopped updating their COVID stats at the end of last year, said that Mexico had 7.7 million confirmed cases and over 334,000 COVID deaths, which I think puts it in like the top 5 globally. The vaccine rollout was first for people who worked in medicine, public school teachers, frontline, essential workers, and then by age, based on like your decade of age. Vaccines became available several months after the US for most people, but to be fair, once they were available, they were really easy to get and they were free, and actually they still are. The dates and times and locations where you can get a free booster or vaccination are more limited, and you can pay to have an appointment at a pharmacy, but you still can get free vaccinations. That said, AMLO, like personally, was like, oh, COVID vibes are off, and just like didn't take it seriously at all. He basically almost never wore a mask. He like flat out refused to socially distance. And after delivering an iconic speech claiming to see the quote unquote lights at the end of the tunnel, the very next day he tested positive for COVID and then got COVID a second time. So Mexico was the 3rd most visited country in the world in 2022 because it never closed its borders. And by the end of 2021, more than 500,000 Americans came to visit or live in Mexico, especially in places like Mexico City and Tulum. At one point, by the way, 1 in 5 COVID infections in New York City were linked to Tulum. And
wild.
No surprise here, there was a huge spike in COVID infections in Mexico in early 2022. Now, I want to talk about this. It's uncomfortable, but I'm just going to say it. There is an understandable but very hostile anti-American attitude in Mexico right now, especially in places like Mexico City. Looking at statistics like the one I just listed and considering how awful a lot of Americans are, it's easy to blame them. I'm very sympathetic to that, and I really understand. And over the years, there have been these sort of like show sweeps of the military checking people's IDs, again, in places like Tulum, places like where there are a lot of Americans. But ultimately, AMLO's government did very little to like stop this wave of people. A lot of the common criticisms that you hear about American foreigners from Mexican people in Mexico is that Americans are there illegally and that they're evading taxes. And honestly, that is not actually true. Of course, there may be people who overstay their visas, but it's actually legal for people to be in Mexico on a tourist visa for up to 180 days at a time. And if you leave and come back in, they typically just keep reissuing those 180-day visas. Even if you want to go the extra step to obtain your residency, it's usually done under something called residency through economic solvency. And you're required to show that you have either like a bunch of money in your savings or that you make a monthly income of somewhere between, like 1,900 and I think like 3,200 US dollars. It actually isn't the same everywhere. It depends on which embassy you go through, strangely, but you don't have to pay any taxes on that. And even if you do overstay your visa, whether it's a tourist visa or a residency visa, as a US citizen, usually the only thing that happens is you pay a small fine that is like less than $40. So not to like get super off topic, but like in other countries, for example, like Portugal and Spain, just for reference, that had a similar influx of quote unquote digital nomads during and after COVID, they've issued specific digital nomad visas and they tax them at 19 and 24% respectively. I think it's right around there. Obviously, people still find ways around it, EU passport holders moving around, tourist visas, et cetera. But again, governments in like city governments like Barcelona limited how many Airbnbs there could be. During COVID, when Vietnam wanted foreigners to leave who weren't having their visas be renewed, they were charging people every single day so that people felt really motivated to exit the country when their documents had expired. So I just wanted to demonstrate, right, that there's like very straightforward policy measures that could have been taken to limit the number of foreigners who showed up, disrespecting the culture, not taking COVID precautions seriously, burdening the healthcare system and the infrastructure system, and gentrifying certain areas.
Yeah.
So like death to America, Americans are annoying, and also they actually, for the most part, were not doing something illegal.
The owners of the business that I work for have a $2.5 million house in Puerto Vallarta, and they continued to visit it all through COVID. In fact, one of them was in Mexico, got COVID, realized that he could not then get back into the United States because you have to have a negative COVID test in order to do that. So he flew to like wherever the nearest airport is to Juarez. It might be in Juarez. And he walked across the border into El Paso and then rented a car and drove to wherever the nearest airport is to there, and then flew back home. Like just an absolute shithead, like just the worst fucking dude.
And don't get me wrong, there were a metric fuck ton, that is the accurate statistic, of these kinds of shitheads. And also there should have been policies in place that made that not an option.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when we talk about, right, the foreigners burdening the infrastructure, we can't really talk about that without talking about water. 1% of water in Mexico is for domestic use. And yet, the country has severe droughts and water shortages. The other 99% of the water goes to things like factory farming and agriculture, mining operations, big pharma, production of different things, and tourism. Mexico City, the place that used to be a fucking lake, is running out of water. And when I say running out of water, I don't mean day zero is on the horizon. I mean, for some parts of the city, it has come and gone, and people in lower income neighborhoods regularly go without water and have been doing so for over a year. There's a similar problem, obviously, in other parts of Mexico, like Guadalajara, now more and more Puebla, and of course, the Baja Peninsula, which is a desert. And that is a place that has struggled with water security for a very long time. One of the things that contributes to this problem is urban expansion, obviously, because the concrete keeps water from making its way back into the soil, which also leads to flooding. So it's like water everywhere and literally not a drop to drink. A lot of rivers have been completely destroyed by these projects. That's obviously not entirely like at AMLO's feet, of course, but it continued under the watch of his administration. And there's also, again, the issue that I brought up before of the earthquakes, which when combined with these like lower and lower and lower aquifers, literally causes the city to sink. And it's a vicious cycle because as the city sinks, there's less space for the aquifers, and it also increasingly damages the infrastructure, right? Like you can imagine if you've built a house and the house settles, it's like that, except a city with over 20 million people.
Right.
Just Mexico City alone. And then, of course, there's the other issue, corporations and their monopolization of water to make things like soda and beer. According to official data, the Modelo Beer Company, which is technically a local Mexican brand, but it's actually owned by US-based Constellation Brands, is authorized to use 8 million cubic meters of water per year. And just to put that into perspective, is the equivalent to like the domestic use of 160,000 people. So we see this in contrast to things like energy, which AMLO is very, very adamant about nationalizing, right? And yet he's happy to sell off water rights. And the worst example in the country is obviously in the state of Nuevo León, where according to a 2022 statistic, 11.8 billion gallons, I'm sorry, I'm going back and forth between gallons and liters, of fresh water are siphoned annually for several different companies. And that amounts to about like 40 times more than the amount that's allotted in the same area for domestic use. So this is companies like Danone, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, and even a bunch of Mexico's banks are in on the action, and they're becoming these so-called like water millionaires, all while roughly a third of that region have regular water outages that can last for hours or even weeks at a time. And then, of course, you have instances where there are like tourist attractions like golf courses and hotels with jacuzzis and swimming pools and laundries and spas. And something that I think maybe will come as a surprise to some people who visited Mexico, but only in certain areas. The infrastructure development differential in different parts of Mexico is enormous. And so a lot of these tourist areas, and I think like the best example of this would be Tulum, no matter how luxurious they appear, they don't have grid electricity and water. We get into this a little bit more later, but like normal people, regular people, don't have grid electricity. They don't even have city water to lean on. So these like eco-friendly luxury hotels, yes, maybe they run a little bit on solar, but a lot of them are running on generators and having the water trucked in. Just an anecdotal story. I was somewhere once in Mexico that was like a mostly working class neighborhood, and we went without water for 2 weeks at a time while golf courses and resorts and factory farms like took all the water.
Very cool.
Super cool. So another issue where AMLO is really at his best is the woman question. It's not funny. Femicide and gender-based violence.
Are they shopping?
They would be shopping if they were alive. Femicide and gender-based violence is and has been an enormous problem in Mexico. A 2022 article said that 11 women were killed every day in Mexico because of violence against women and girls specifically. In addition to the murder and disappearances, so-called law enforcement does little or nothing to solve the murders or offer any kind of justice to the victims' families. So understandably, protests break out in Mexico against femicide and missing and murdered women and girls. And among those protests, there are signs calling AMLO to take action and even saying things like AMLO is killing us. In his absolute worst take ever, he responds with, everything they say to me, isn't that gender-based violence, or is gender only female?
Oh boy.
Womp womp.
He went on to say that the feminist movement began in 2019.
Oh.
Hot take.
Yeah, reverse sexism.
Essentially, yeah.
Has anyone checked on the men? Regarding abortion, by the way, people in Mexico seeking abortions have historically been put in jail for terminating pregnancies, but as of 2023, the Mexican Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional for the federal government to criminalize abortion. So that's great. That said, about AMLO himself, he's not particularly pro-abortion and has never really said anything about it. He usually just sort of suggests like leaving it up to the states. But as of now, it is nationally decriminalized, which is really important, by the way, because there are two types of Plan B for all you ovulation heads out there. One kind of Plan B, it will delay you from ovulating. The other kind prevents the implantation. right? Mexico only has the first kind. So if you've already ovulated and you're seeking Plan B, it's readily available at most pharmacies, but it won't work for you. So it's really important that there are other things that are in place. Okay, that's just a little dipping our toes into the lady issue before we move on to energy sovereignty. So as I've said, AMLO is, at least rhetorically, and I guess personally, not particularly a fan of the US. He says, Mexico is an independent and free country, not a colony or protectorate of the United States. Cooperation, yes. Submission, no. Long live the oil expropriation.
Damn.
His stated goal was to achieve 54% Mexican-owned power, and he's actually surpassed it, according to a statistic from last year that said he's now at 56%. So basically, the government did this just by purchasing foreign-owned power plants. It's pretty cool. When it comes to oil, despite being a country with a lot of oil resources, most of Mexico's oil is imported. As you know, AMLO's got a long history with state-owned oil giant Pemex. Do you guys remember Pemex?
Mm-hmm. Yo.
Yes, early in his career where he's like bloody and doing the protests. Okay. Because they're state-owned, they play a key role in AMLO's energy plan, which leans on building these like massive oil refineries, including one in his home state of Tabasco. A little paragraph here from a 2022 Dissent magazine article. I'm going to put this in the notes. I really recommend people read it if you have time, because it's really interesting. I just don't have time to cover it. Pemex is central to AMLO's plans for regional development in the country's poorer southeast. It is also key to his goal of energy sovereignty. To achieve this goal, his government is providing the heavily indebted company with capital injections, fiscal credits, and generous budget increases. It's also very corrupt, allegedly. The federal government has also rehabilitated old refineries and begun the construction of a new one, and even purchased a facility in Texas. AMLO's plan for energy has been to decrease private ownership and increase control for the Federal Electricity Commission, or it's called the CFE. Also very corrupt. Also very interesting.
Allegedly.
I heard about it as a rumor. I can't know. And so AMLO uses a lot of really clever rhetoric, again, to find appeal for these energy reforms in like small business owners and people that you would think of that would not necessarily be in favor of like state-controlled things. And so again, you see this like example of building broad appeal, but you can't please everyone, hey? And there was a lot of pushback with both environmentalists and indigenous groups. And at one point, when it came to protests against specifically thermoelectric power, he goes, listen, left-wing radicals, from me, you are nothing more than conservatives. Ooh, sick burn.
Horseshoe theory confirmed.
We need like a Proles bingo. Another area of exploration that's a pretty big win for AMLO is Mexico's lithium reserves. A 2023 decree nationalizes all of the lithium resources in Mexico. The downside of this nationalization of energy, which again, I think that as socialists, we can see as like a positive thing, it's quite tough because we have another one of these false dichotomies where a lot of the renewables that are available are owned by foreign companies. And we can see here an example of AMLO choosing nationalism and sovereignty over climate-focused solutions. But also, we see this devolving into that sort of false binary that like, I don't think it needs to be. And frankly, like it can't be in a world without climate catastrophe, right? Like his efforts to prioritize existing Mexican energy companies leans really heavily on fossil fuels rather than what he could be doing, which is investing in helping Mexico develop its own sustainable renewable energy sources. There are some hydro projects, but as I just said, that's less and less reliable because Mexico has a very significant water insecurity issue.
Yeah. On that note, Colorado provides a lot of water to the southwestern states, to Nevada, to California, to Arizona. In fact, I think... Oh God, I'm not even going to try to remember the numbers. Colorado keeps a very tiny percentage of the water that is generated by the snowmelt in the mountains here.
I think we keep about one Biden.
One Biden. Yeah, I think it might be less than that, actually. I think it might be only 15% or something.
According to a recent statistic, it is 0.5 of one Biden.
Oh shit, that's very low. So anyway, but because of climate change, because of the intense increase in average temperatures, and because of the intense increase in water usage in the Southwest, Hoover Dam is barely able to function at the level it is supposed to. If it gets much lower, it will not function anymore. And because luckily last year, our rainy season was exceptionally long, we got a lot more water than we were expecting. We were able to send another extensive amount of the water that we do normally keep over to Nevada to refill Lake Mead by, just again, tiny fractions of the full volume of Lake Mead, which has been dropping steadily since the 1970s or 80s, I forget which, and is now at very it's unreal how low the levels are. You should look at satellite maps. It's fucking crazy. But that's not going to keep going forever. We will not have surplus forever, and we will not be able to continue to send water to Nevada to keep Lake Mead full, to keep Hoover Dam running, which is bad because Hoover Dam supplies most of the electricity for Las Vegas, which requires a lot of electricity. Yeah, so that's fun.
Something important to note is that while there are so many diverse indigenous populations in Mexico, the majority of indigenous people in the Yucatan Peninsula specifically are Mayan. And the Maya have a very difficult history with Mexico. In fact, they seceded from Mexico in 1839 and were reabsorbed into the Mexican state in 1843 because the sanctions were so severe, they actually ran out of trading partners. And still today, Mayan people on the whole have a complicated relationship with Mexicanness and Mexico. So we're going to talk about AMLO's biggest scamlo, the Tren Maya, the Mayan train. The Yucatan Peninsula is home to the second largest rainforest in the Americas. Sorry, babe. I think the Americas are 2 continents, second only to the Amazon. And when AMLO proposed the idea for this train project, a high-speed rail network through several of the poorest states in Mexico, he said in 2018 that the project would create hundreds of thousands of jobs and not, and I quote, uproot a single tree. So look, you'd have to really fuck up a biodiesel-powered high-speed rail network for a communist to shit on it, but that's exactly what's about to happen. Pretty much right away, indigenous communities push back against this plan. AMLO has a long and uneasy history with the Zapatistas, which honestly, we really should do a separate episode on it, but they push back pretty much immediately. I just say that because they are among the first to criticize the project. The Zapatistas are not in the part of the country that is affected by the train project, but they're not the only ones. Environmental groups and indigenous groups within the Yucatan are incredibly vocal when speaking out against the harms of this train project because, unsurprisingly, several trees would be uprooted. Actually, likely over 9 million trees were uprooted, as well as roughly 3,000 homes that found themselves along the path, against which legal cases have been made because it's not legal for local people to lose their homes or be resettled for tourist projects. Not to mention, obviously, countless animals, mangroves, and other living things in one of the most biodiverse regions in the country, as well as many discovered and, as of yet, undiscovered ancient sacred sites. There were a series of assemblies held with these communities along the route where they sort of sent representatives, and the administration was promising that if the communities voted against the plan, they would move the route or they would stop the construction completely. But repeatedly, Mayan communities denied this, saying that they had no actual agency, that their questions were not answered, that they were being pressured to agree, that they were being manipulated, and that the assemblies were really just for show. Every time the administration consults pretty much anyone, whether an environmental group or indigenous people, or even literally the engineers that they were trying to get to design the project, everyone was like, no, this is a crazy idea. We don't even know how many cenotes there are. Okay, so a quick note about the Yucatan Peninsula. The meteor that killed the dinosaurs landed in the Yucatan Peninsula. And a result of that meteor created really unique properties in the soil that allow for this gorgeous network of above ground and underwater interconnected caves. And these are what's called
cave pools, actually.
Cave pools. They're called the cenotes. It kind of means like a sinkhole. They're the ones that you see on Instagram, right? And many of these lesser known cenotes actually were already just filled with cement to build the train. And again, they are all physically connected by this fragile and very delicate soil, as well as connected to the sea. It's worth mentioning that some of the families who were relocated were given about what would be $40,000 US to move their homes. Obviously, as a result of little stopgaps like that, some people are in favor of the project because they buy into the rhetoric that like it'll bring jobs and tourism and infrastructure and make it even easier to transport things because there are cargo trains. But again, a Marxist view reminds us that it doesn't have to be climate destruction or poverty, right? These are not the only options. And one only needs, again, to bring it up, to look at Tulum, which despite being one of the most luxurious tourist destinations in the country, doesn't even have paved roads in most areas. And again, still does not have grid electricity, and the water comes in on a truck. So the money and the jobs and the opportunities, unsurprisingly, have not trickled down, right? Which brings us to another point about the water in the cenotes. A lot of the Yucatan is almost feudal in a way, in the sense that there are places, there is land, there are these cenotes that are more or less community owned and managed. And without having grid electricity and city water, local communities rely on these freshwater cenotes for their drinking water, for bathing, also for relief from the heat. The Yucatan had its hottest recorded temperature recently at 43 degrees Celsius, which is 109 degrees Fahrenheit. And people were saying that it felt like 56 degrees Celsius or 133 degrees Fahrenheit, as well as having the cultural significance of playing like a pretty key role in Mayan spiritual rituals and traditions. So this is after decades of water and resource mismanagement, leading to a 59% reduction of fresh water in just the past 2 decades. Again, that's not AMLO's fault, but it's easily his decisions are putting some of the most water-rich parts of Mexico in danger of being just as water insecure as the rest of the country. Also, as you can imagine, some people who were initially supporting the proposal back when it was like sunshine and living trees are now regretting it or feeling manipulated, or they were lied to, or they were duped, or in the case of those who took the relocation money, they're saying that they feel bought, which I really want to highlight here, because not only does AMLO begin his political career by aligning himself with indigenous interests, he's also constantly promoting this vision of sovereignty. But when it comes to the indigenous people in his own country, he seems like not to think that that's very important.
So, question here. You've used this term a couple times. I don't know if this can be the name of the episode or not, but you referred to AMLO as a SCAMLO, right? Is that a phrase? Like, where does that come from? Is that like a conservative phrase, or does the left phrase?
No, that's a Raeism. That's a Raeism.
Okay, it's a Raeism.
That wouldn't really take off any. I mean, first of all, again, popular opinion for AMLO is super, super, super high. I started saying it because Martín and I happen to have a lot of experience in and around the area of Mexico where the Tren Maya is. And when this project started, there was, at least sort of nominally and rhetorically, a lot of support. Again, mostly because the questions were posed in ways that really highlighted what it could bring to the community and didn't really mention any of the potential damage. And so, of course, the support was very high. And I was like, this is a scam. And I started saying SCAMLO, but it wouldn't really like work in Spanish. So I can't really imagine it like taking off. But when it comes,
heard it here first, guys.
Proles exclusive.
Proles exclusive.
In terms of the service, though, right? How's the train? Well, it's nice. The train is nice. Even though there was a derailment and no one died, and then another incident where 2 people got run over and one of them did die.
Ooh.
It's a lovely train and the stations look good. But it's not that cheap. So just for one example, the train from Merida to Cancun, which if you were driving it, depends if you were driving or taking the bus, but it would be like between maybe 4 and 6 hours, is 735 Mexican pesos for like the lower class, which there's like a first class on the train as well, which comes out to about $43, compared to the same route on the bus, which is closer to $37. And again, remembering that a day laborer's wage is about $14. Not to mention, Merida, which is the largest city in the whole peninsula, it's bigger than Cancun, doesn't actually have a train station in the city. The closest one is about 30 minutes from downtown. So you'd still need to rely on the bus system or a car or a taxi or something like that to get to and from the station, as there's not a metro or something like that. Whereas by contrast, again, the bus has several different stations in both Merida and in Cancun. And in addition to literally taking the Mayan name, Tren Maya, the Mayan train, and culture while displacing existing Mayan people and contaminating their sacred sites and their water sources, it's also, wait for it, wholly owned and operated by the military. military,
Oh,
with the profits funding the military pension, because AMLO sidesteps the safety and the environmental concerns under the guise of calling this project, as well as the aforementioned $8 billion oil refinery, part of a broader project for national security. Which brings us to our last little segment here about AMLO, the National Guard and increased militarization. So it's fair to know the military has been like slowly increasing in Mexico since around 2006, sort of like war on drugs vibes. And despite, rhetorically existing for external threats, it's obviously consistently used against the Mexican population. When AMLO was campaigning, he ran on this sort of hugs, not bullets, his words, not mine, approach, offering social programs.
Which in Spanish, rhymes. Abrazos, no balazos.
amazing.
Offering social programs to deter young people from getting involved with organized crime. He also promised, and I quote, "We are not going to act as policemen for any foreign government. Mexico first. Our home comes first." Once again, underlining, right, this sort of like nationalist position, despite, I think, some obvious contradictions. But then in 2019, he passes a decree that creates the National Guard, which replaces the federal police. The National Guard was originally under civilian control, but even then hired almost exclusively people from the military. And then in 2022, legislation was passed that officially handed the National Guard to the control of the military, which obviously received a lot of criticism for giving the military too much power. While it's fair to note that in some areas, AMLO did increase social spending, he significantly increased military spending. In the first 3 years of his presidency alone, spending for the military went up 54%. And this doesn't come out of nowhere because apparently, according to WikiLeaks, allegedly, he had a secret meeting in 2006 with the US ambassador promising to increase military intervention in drug trafficking, even though when he campaigned publicly, he said exactly the opposite. And there are decades of evidence, no surprise here, showing that military intervention and violence doesn't do anything to eliminate drug trafficking, but it does significantly increase things like executions, state-backed disappearances, and torture, while violent crime continues to plateau at best and actually increase. Finally, remember all the way back into the early days when we were young and naive with the Mexico City airport? Well, it never got built, but you know what did happen? That money was put toward adding a commercial wing to an existing military airbase in the greater Mexico City area. Owned and operated by the military. Again, there was negative environmental impact and a lack of transparency, but he got around it by saying it was for national security. For what it's worth, Mexico City is really busy and the new airport is really nice. Finally, Mexico is still a very dangerous and deadly place for journalists. The military has continued to increase surveillance on journalists. Journalists continue to get fired or disappeared, or worse. Murder rates in general have plateaued, but not really decreased. And before we look into the future, that's what I got. So I don't know, where do you guys think AMLO fits?
Oh man, I mean, like it's. We're not going to look at this as like he's evil or he's good. He has done some positive things for the working class. He has done some not positive things for the working class, and particularly for indigenous folks. But it would be preferable to have him in office than a far right candidate. You know what I mean? Like, or somebody who was directly under the thumb of the United States and a puppet of the US, regardless of their political, sort of situation. So mixed bag, I guess.
So are you asking people to hold their nose and vote?
Stop.
And in the event that they were holding their nose and voting, who would they be voting for?
Pokemon Go to the polls.
Looking to the future, Martín, can you tell them, since AMLO is only allowed 1 6-year term, who are we looking at voting for if we're interested in supporting the Morena party? I guess if we're Mexican voters.
So first off, you have to know that Gen Z in Mexico is shipping the two candidates who are women. One is Xochitl Galvez, who is basically the opposition candidate. Like it's a three-party coalition between sworn enemies a decade ago or a couple of decades ago of the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD. And on Morena's side, there's Claudia Sheinbaum, who, as mentioned before, she has a bachelor's in physics, a master's in energy engineering, was the Secretary of the Environment during AMLO's mayorship, and she led and ironically, in that she led the Segundo Piso, the highway project in Mexico City. Afterwards, she runs for Jefe Delegacional of Tlampal and wins, which is sort of like chief of a borough within Mexico City. And then, in tandem to AMLO's presidency run, she runs for mayor of Mexico City and wins. During that time, her biggest controversy is the fact that Line 12 of Mexico City's metro collapses and kills 26 people. And she blames this on construction defects when it's clear lack of funding and neglect that, of course, preceded her, but she also continued. And finally, she runs in the primary at Morena and wins. And of course, this primary is sort of another big finger disguised as a primary, as Marcelo Ebrard.
Give us the finger that you think we deserve at patreon.com/ProlesPod.
Exactly. So former Chancellor, Mexico's version of the Secretary of State, Marcelo Ebrard, also was running in that primary and disputed the results. And ultimately, he remains in the party, but Claudia was clearly AMLO's favorite, and she ironically wins. And as of this writing, she has 60% voter intent.
If I can, I would just like to offer a few quotes of things that she said. These quotes were in English. We'll make sure to link to the interview that she does with Breakthrough News. When she's speaking on Cuba, she says, "We're against any kind of blockade because people suffer from that. Cubans have to decide what happens in Cuba. That's a principle of the foreign policy of Mexico. It's in the Constitution to honor the sovereignty of any country. We have ties with Cuba, and right now we have benefited from Cuban doctors that are coming to Mexico because in the last decade, medical schools have closed so much that we don't have enough doctors. So we're looking to any country who wants to help us have a good health system, and Cuba said they would help, so we're paying for that help. They have to decide their future, not anybody else." I think there are some complicated things within that, but moving on, she says on Mexican sovereignty, "I'm against it," referring to U.S. interference. "The drug market between Mexico and the U.S., it's because the U.S. has more consumers than Mexico. It's cooperation. It's not invasion. It's not violence. We have to work together to stop the consumption and to stop the market of firearms that come mainly from the U.S. It's mutual." And then finally, when she's talking about the Morena party and the future of the party, she says, "General pension, a lot of scholarships for poor people, universal scholarship for high school students that go to public schools. We're going to have a new train in the South." I'm blessing myself for those who can't see me. "Another train that goes from the Pacific to the Atlantic. We're going to have several ports. We have a new airport, investment in new roads." And I think if you can sort of listen between the lines there, that kind of demonstrates a very similar contradiction and tension in Sheinbaum's politic as it did in AMLO's.
That about does it for this episode. Thank you so much to our newest permanent proles, Rae and Martín, and to all of our listeners.
And to Rudy Giuliani.
If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolespod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all that algorithm stuff, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity
Happy
forever.
Cinco de Mayo.
And, yeah, that too.
Solidarity forever.
Canceled.
They envision the entire world Sovietized communist style. Communist style.